Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David White. I'm from Axio. We'll do additional introductions in just a few minutes. I'm joined today by Rich Caralli. Rich, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
And let's. Should we get started, or should we give folks a minute to dial in? Let's get started. Thank you for joining on time. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll jump into the webinar. So today's webinar is titled "Which Cybersecurity Framework Should I Use?" This has become a very crowded space. Rich Caralli and I will be spending some time with you today to try to help demystify this space and give you some tips, not only for which framework to use, but how to select that framework and then how to effectively use it to optimize your results. Our agenda today is very, very straightforward. We're going to start with a little bit of history on models, frameworks, and so forth in the cybersecurity space. We'll just spend a few minutes on fundamentals, kind of the things you should look for in any model or framework that you might be using. We're going to spend some time talking about your motivation. What's your why? What's your why turns out to be a really critical thing to understand in order to succeed with both selecting and using a cybersecurity framework or model to guide your program. We'll talk about the landscape of models, frameworks, control catalogs, guidelines, standards, regulations, and so forth that are currently present. I won't promise that we will not boil the ocean there, but we will give you some tips on how to navigate that landscape and give you some sort of 10,000-foot view of what we currently view, what we think is important to note about that landscape. And then we will end with some guidance on where to start, and how to succeed. I'm David White. I'm the co-founder and president at Axio. Prior to founding Axio, I worked at Carnegie Mellon University in the Software Engineering Institute at the CERT program, and that is where I met Rich Caralli. So Rich has been a colleague, a manager, a co-conspirator, a co-author, a friend, a customer, and now back to collaborator throughout the last 20 years. Rich and I have known one another. Rich is the person who is responsible for me working in the cybersecurity industry. So Rich, I want to thank you for that because I'm having a fantastic time. I had the privilege of working with Rich for 13 years at the Software Engineering Institute, where he was my boss, and he served as the chief architect for the development of the CERT resilience management model. We'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation today. Currently, Rich is working as the lead GRC consultant at a company called CISO LLC. Rich, really appreciate you joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation. Thank you for sharing your 30+ years of experience with the listeners today.
Dave, I appreciate the kind words, and it's nice to get the band back together. As we start this, let's talk a little bit about the CERT resilience management model, because that's kind of where we intersected. And just to poke us a little bit here about this, this technology is 10 years old now, so that's probably why my picture has aged a lot since then. But the interesting thing about it is, not only does this technology continue to hold up, but it's being used in more recent frameworks. And so if you look at CMMC, for example, you're going to see a lot of processes and practices and artifacts from CERT RMM, and you're also going to see the application of the maturity concept. So this is something that we sort of catalyzed starting back in 2001. So why are we telling you this story? Well, it's a tale of why good frameworks are conceived, built, tested, and institutionalized. And it's a little bit of a cautionary tale about framework adoption, because one of the things we try to do with CERT RMM is to build the adoption methods into the framework so that it's not an add-on. It's not something that you have to do in addition to. It's sort of the way you adopt it. So it's kind of interesting to go back to 2001 to when we had a lot of naysayers in the organization that said, well, not only couldn't this be done, but it shouldn't be done. Because what will happen is if you create a maturity model for security and somebody achieves high levels in that, they're going to say, well, we're level 5 in this model, and that means we're secure. But I think they were missing the point, and I think it took us 10 years to convince them. But
Yeah.
the real point was that what we were doing was defining a continuous process that traverses the organization and never ends. And we wanted to find ways to get past the typical one and done propensity of many frameworks. We wanted the processes to stick. We wanted them to become part of the culture. We wanted to inculcate them. And you know, what is culture after all? It's a way of doing things. It's a system of common beliefs and practices and norms. You don't think about it. You just do it. You don't really give it too much consciousness. It just has staying power. And so we were really dismayed with just practices, and practice bodies sort of seemed disparate and ad hoc and loosely and inconsistently adopted. And we looked to the software engineering world because, after all, that's where we were working. And you know, they raised programming, and I put that in air quotes, to an engineering discipline, and they used process and structure and measurement. And we thought maybe that would work here. And we said, well, you know, how did they measure success? How did they know the model was working? And if you look at CMMI, for example, defect reduction was what they were after, an ability to know that defects had gone down per 1,000 lines of code. But the problem we had in security is that we didn't have an analog. We thought maybe events would be an analog, but they're problematic for a lot of reasons, because maybe you can reduce events that you have control over, but certainly the event world around you would not have control over. So we looked to the maturity concepts that were in CMMI, which are known as institutionalizing features, and we said, you know what, that might work. It might be a way to make processes more deliberate and less ad hoc and give them a beginning and an end. And we knew that if we could define a process, we probably could apply all the process improvement concepts and build those in so that a process activity actually evolves over time. And if you think about processes, they're more like manufacturing processes. You know, you have raw materials that go in, they get transformed, and things come out. And so where practices often don't have a core objective, processes usually have observable outcomes and artifacts. And so we brought all of that into CERT RMM. And, you know, at the end, they said, don't do it, but we did. And we're glad we did, because this may be the best way, as you start to look through what we're about to tell you, to get a framework, adopt it, and inculcate it. Because what you really want it to do is to become part of your fabric.
Yeah, and Rich, I think that, you know, increasingly in the cybersecurity world, folks are latching onto that concept, because you hear a lot of CISOs today talk about, you know, establishing a battle rhythm, or, you know, sort of a playbook to make sure that all the things they have to keep to stay on top of are being stayed on top of, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's nothing more than a process. And so you and I spent some time building a partial history and family tree. So these are not all of the frameworks and models we're going to talk about today, but there are some key sort of trends on this evolution. So can you just say a few words about the kind of evolution of these frameworks and kind of how the RMM work fits into that family tree?
Well, what I really love about this slide, and not until you pull this together did it really hit me, but this looks like an evolution of concepts in a lot of ways. But really what it is, as you get out to 2020 and 2022, is a tacit and full acceptance that maturity concepts, and not necessarily maturity scaling or measurement, you know, in the levels, but those maturity concepts of institutionalization are becoming the way that security culture is created. And frameworks, which were once a collection of practices, are now being institutionalized. So if you go from the left side to the right side, what you're really seeing now is an acknowledgement that you have to be able to implement that framework in the culture, or you're just going to do it one and done and you're going to move on.
Yeah.
And the thing I really think it's interesting in here is that in the now 30-year-old history of CMM and CMMI, a lot of other methods in software development life cycles have come about. You have DevOps, you have secure DevOps, you have CI/CD pipelines, you have Agile. But the core principles of defect reduction and making practices stick continues. So yes, these newer approaches seem more flexible, and but they are still disciplined. They are still grounded in process. You can't really divorce them. And so what I love about this is that history bodes well for security frameworks that are constructed using similar principles, because if CMMI is any predictor, then these frameworks that have analogs to CMMI should have staying power. And I think that bodes well for our community.
That's a great point. And I think that, that seminal work of Watts, Humphrey, and team on CMM, that's still the language that the world uses to talk about maturity in sort of any business pursuit or organizational pursuit, is that language from CMM. I'm continually amazed by the number of folks that I see and hear using those CMM maturity concepts, even in their NIST cybersecurity framework assessments and use. Which is more evidence to the point that you're making. And one of the things that I think you and I became really conscious of throughout our journey with RMM and several other models and frameworks on this page that we've had roles in, is the extent to which these are approximations. They are in fact models or frameworks, if you want to call them that, but they're approximations. And so we couldn't spend time together without going back to one of the favorite quotes that you and I used at many times when we were standing around a whiteboard trying to build something that was useful. And I think that there's, this is one of the first key takeaways maybe from today's talk, is that all of these models are wrong. And so the first answer to which cybersecurity framework should I use is use one that's useful. And use one that's useful for you and for how you're using it. And that's one of the key threads that we're gonna spend time on today.
Yeah, and I think we're going to tell you about some of the adoption process, which is almost as important as the framework. But as you think about whether a framework is useful or not, if you go to the next slide, Dave, there's some fundamentals you're going to see in all frameworks. So if you look at the component side, almost every framework is going to have some variation of these things. They'll have program definition and practices that you can select from, and so on. What's really important here, though, is that almost every model has number one and number two. In fact, we have a proliferation of models that have those things. But as you become a good model consumer, realize that better models will have what's in 3 and 4. And if you're really lucky, they'll have what's in 5. The implementation guidance is a way that you transform from a practice on paper to a practice in actuality. And a good model is giving you the way to do that. And better yet, good models will give you artifacts. They will tell you that if you put this process in place, these are the observable outcomes you should see. They should be things that are tangible and that you can observe and that you can monitor. And a lot of practice bodies don't really give you that. They give you the base practice. You don't have any real understanding of why that practice is in place or what you're going to see when it's actually operating. And if you go to the uses side, to add on to that, what's really important about frameworks and should be one of your selection criteria is that framework should help you guide technology acquisition, because we all know people, process, technology, you have to have all three in place to do a great security job. And it should help you rationalize the technology you already have in place. I mean, I've been in situations where I've seen, 15 or 20 monitoring tools, for example. And it looks like what's really happening there is we kept acquiring monitoring tools, hoping they'd be easy to implement, and gave up on that one and went to the next one. And so lining these two things up is really going to help you give your framework sticking power. And when you start to really think about these components, like, is a framework, robust enough? It's all going to depend on what your why is. Why are you even taking this on? What is really driving your need to adopt a framework?
That's a great segue, Rich, for the what's your why, and your why informs what you choose. And so, Rich and I put together a list of 5 common drivers that we've seen throughout our decades of work in this space that that lead to organizations choosing one framework or another. And we drew a line down the middle of the page because there's something different about these drivers on the top than the drivers on the bottom. So if you're facing a regulatory compliance driver, right? Those limit your choice. In that case, the framework really does find you, because if the law says thou shalt follow, thou shalt comply with this framework, then you really don't have any choice. Now, one of the nuances about compliance is that if that's what the law says, then there's a built-in incentive to limit the application of that compliance model or compliance framework to the minimum set of organizational assets or processes or activities that you apply it to. So you want to sort of minimize the footprint that a compliance auditor can come in and evaluate you against, so that you maximize your chance of compliance. So compliance models, by their nature, typically don't lend themselves well to organization-wide improvement, which is the 4th motivation on the list, right below the line. So above the line are those motivations that you have fewer choices about, and below the line are things that you have a lot of choice about. And we drew the line through strategic initiative because some strategic initiatives you don't have a choice about, and some you do. If you're selling cloud services to a federal agency, then you're going to adopt FedRAMP. You just are, right? That's a given. And so you have a choice about whether that's the strategy you want to follow, but you don't have a choice about that adoption, right? And then, third-party certifications, you have more choice about that than you do about compliance programs. But that's a really important driver for a lot of folks. Organizational improvement, I think, is one of the most important drivers, especially for cybersecurity leaders. Selecting a model or framework that you can use to guide your entire improvement is a really important undertaking, and can make, in my experience, an enormous difference in building an effective cybersecurity program. We do have a question, Rich, and I'm kind of inclined to just answer that question now.
Yeah, I think that question is really timely, because what you're saying, Dave, and this is what one of the points we'd implore you to take away from here, is that you are likely going to operate in a multi-model world. So yes, so to your question about healthcare and using the NIST controls, absolutely, you are sort of going to be directed into those NIST controls, depending on the framework you pick. And again, a lot, and we're going to see in the next slide, those NIST controls are the bridge between sometimes the compliance and the left side of this slide and the right side. That can often be the bridge. But here's what I would tell you to do, and I've seen this working with customers for many years, is that just because HR 7898 is pushing you in the NIST direction, what you should be thinking about is your real objectives, your real whys for adopting any framework, and see if, as you're adopting those NIST practices for a specific healthcare focus, where else will they be useful to you? So if you look at this slide, the middle is really kind of, in a lot of ways, a bridge between the two ends. On one side, you have regulations, and these things are going to be pushed at you, and you're going to have to conform to them. And on the left side, you typically see organizations select from that group because they have an internal imperative to improve security or build a security program, or the board may be asking them for some way to frame their evolution and their progress. Those control catalogs that sort of sit in the middle, you will see them showing up in the two ends. And so if you are forced into those control catalogs in the center, my imperative to you would be always be thinking about, if I do this control one time, can I comply with or find my way into more than one framework? Because if you get the basics right, and Dave is going to show you a little bit of this in the Axio tool, and it was one of the reasons my organization loved that tool, was because I had a lot of competing objectives. I had some imperatives and I had some requirements, and I was trying to satisfy both. And often one framework's not going to do it. You're going to have to be able to translate across these frameworks. So if you are working in a very control-oriented structure, that might actually be one of the best advantages you're going to have to do that. So I think, nominally, again, a lot of these don't sit in these spaces as nice and tidy as we put them. They sit on the lines. But for the most part, you are seeing a spectrum here. And you have to realize that that spectrum exists, and that you will likely find yourself at some point in a multi-model approach, whether by choice or by accident.
Yeah, Rich, one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is as we were building this slide for the webinar today, is how many times we redrafted the definition to get things into what we thought were the right buckets. So this actually took a lot more work than I thought it would when we started out, because we started with one categorization scheme and then we landed on this one, which I feel pretty good about. But that was an interesting journey for me. And I think that I've seen lots of organizations using something from the left as their overall improvement driver, with a control catalog from the middle as the sort of the menu of controls from which they build their cybersecurity strategy to achieve the program definition that comes from one of those models or frameworks on the left. And then the stuff on the right, you're not going to have a choice about, but you also, I think it's in your interest to minimize the application of that. So those things on the right are not, they're not, in my experience, very useful as sort of organization-wide improvements. They're great to sort of narrowly focus.
Yeah, I think if you go back for a second, Dave, I think the one that could be argued is possibly CMMC.
Yeah.
In that, you're going to see organizations adopt it because they're in the defense industrial base, and they're going to be pushed into that. If they want to work on federal contracts, they're going to be pushed into it. But you are seeing some, and at least I'm seeing organizations who put CMMC in the model and framework box because, for the reason you just said, it is more comprehensive and a little bit more at the program level. So I could see that being one that straddles the two extremes.
I completely agree with you. And I was staring at the word CMMC as I said what I did. So thanks for calling that out. The other view that we built is this sort of 4-quadrant view, where we looked at the east-west axis here goes from prescriptive to descriptive. Descriptive frameworks give you a lot more freedom, if you will, in how you meet the objectives in those models or frameworks. Prescriptive tend to be more rules-based, highly specific. And if you choose a prescriptive model or framework, then I would say that be sure to choose one that's being kept up to date, because the more prescriptive something is, the more it may need to change over as the threat landscape and technology landscape changes. And then the north-south axis is a programmatic versus control-centric view. And so we see this cloud of what we called on the last page models and frameworks that's in the primarily in the upper right quadrant. We see control catalog standards and guidelines, which are primarily in the lower left quadrant. And then, like any generalization, you're going to find exceptions to this. But then the world of regulations tend to fit in between those two. And then once we sort of had this realization, we could start to map this back to some of the whys. And Rich, would you like to say a little bit about how the whys play out here on this landscape?
Yeah, I think, as you are looking at those imperatives, it's going to force you into one of these circles primarily. But the reason these circles are drawn the way they are is because there is overlap between them. So ideally, control selection is going to be based on risk, and you're going to go after a certain catalog, as you're adopting, but it's going to force you sort of into one of these spaces. And your whys are going to be built around not only, as I was saying before, not only the imperatives and mandates, but if you are really true to yourself and you list out the other reasons why you want to put considerable work, and again, framework adoption is costly. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of process, it's a lot of technology, it's a lot of human capital. If you're going to do it, make sure that when you're devising your whys, that you look beyond the compliance or the regulation and see if there are other imperatives driving you in the organization, because then you'll be able to come back here, put a pin on this chart, and then start to drive down. What ultimately we would love to see you do is your pin would go in one of those dark blue areas, because then you'd at least be in a multi-model environment and you'd be overlapping the two polar ends. And that's, I mean, I say that tongue in cheek because it sounds really easy, but
yeah,
it's only difficult to the point that you have a whiteboard and smart people in the room, and you really get down to articulating why you're doing this.
That's a great point, Rich. And if we sort of pull the clouds away and look at those individual list of frameworks, models, standards, guidelines, regulations, and so forth, and control catalogs that we had back a few pages ago, this is how we laid them out. And look, please note that we call this a notional map. We're confident of the sort of general position of each one of these, but I'm sure that Rich and I could engage in a lengthy whiteboard debate about whether any one of these should be to the left, right, top, or bottom of any other one of these, if they're in close proximity. So,
and I think we are probably going to do that, right, Dave?
Yeah,
we're going to really work to move these around a little bit.
Exactly.
We can't help ourselves.
Well, and they change over time as well, right?
Right.
And that's to the point that I made earlier. If you pick a control catalog, you really want something that's kept up to date, and so pick something that's gonna be kept up to date, and then it may move a little north, a little south, a little left, a little right over time as kind of the sort of predominant opinions about how to build a strong cybersecurity program, or how to build an effective collection of controls as part of your architecture changes. Then, and so I'd like to, let's go to the second question.
Well, Dave, I was just going to say, I'm loving these questions because,
yes.
Yeah, we could probably talk for the rest of the afternoon about these two questions. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So the second question is, would it make sense to define your cybersecurity strategy beginning with an assessment against a framework, say C2M2? And then, so my answer to that is that makes an enormous amount of sense. And I would say, if you're just starting out to build your strategy, or you're refreshing your strategy, or you're looking to sort of initiate a change process to change your strategy, then starting with one of these things in the upper right quadrant is going to make a lot of sense. it really is going to make a lot of sense. And so C2M2, I think, would be a great choice as a getting started. And if you're just starting to build a cybersecurity program or formalize a cybersecurity program, my opinion would be to start with something up here in the upper right quadrant. And then as you start to build your strategy and develop kind of your cybersecurity architecture, if you will, or what the lay of the land should look like and how you're protecting technology, then you may want to select something from the lower left quadrant to serve as your menu of controls that you implement as part of that strategy. So I think that's a great idea.
Wholeheartedly agree. That upper right quadrant, if you're starting out, the upper right quadrant is where you go. One cautionary tale: if you start with a framework and you get deep into it and you find out you haven't defined why you're doing it, if it's just because you want to see where you are or you want to build a program, you could be too far into it before you can back out. So I would still recommend that if you're just starting out, as Dave said, looking at upper right quadrant, but also define those whys, like really lay out the imperatives and know what you're trying to achieve, because then it will further help you narrow them down. My organization, my past organization, we did C2M2. We did, we used the Axio tool. Great place to start. Lots of good information, and let's be honest, it has some NIST flavor in it. It has those foundations. So absolutely agree, that upper right quadrant. Just be careful and don't just plunge into a framework before knowing why you're doing it.
Yeah.
The other point I wanted to make too is, the question about, can you get yourself into the intersection of all three? I hate to say this, but 853 is kind of the intersection of a lot of them. At least maybe not when they set out and built it, because they built it for a different purpose, but you see it adopted by a lot of these other frameworks as the basis. So, but it is really, it's a lot to take on.
It's a lot. And I'm a fan of 853 also, Rich, but I think that it is, it's a good beast, but it is a beast, right?
Yeah.
And the language is difficult to understand because of how it's written. So you almost have to be a cybersecurity expert to get your head around it. I think that and
it has a lot of government agency undertone. I mean, it's it really is sort of, it shows its purpose.
Yeah.
I think the really interesting thing, just before we get off this slide, is that lower right hand corner.
Yeah.
Where control centric frameworks are pedantic, like they're like, do this, and descriptive frameworks are sort of like, here we're giving you the flexibility to build, and then pieces, parts, the rest of it, so that you're not bound. It's going to be interesting to see if anything emerges in that lower right quadrant, and if there would be usefulness if it did.
Yeah. I sort of, when we were building this, I started thinking of that as the desert, right? Because it may be that when we spend more time on this, we may come up with a better set of axes, because it might be that we've chosen some axes that are dependent on one another. The other thing that I would say, Rich, is that I think if you're just going to choose one, something like C2M2 or CMMC or RMM or CSF or maybe even CIS-20, I think if you were going to only choose one as a place to get started, that would probably be my short list. I don't know. Would you add or subtract anything?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
And if you're at the programmatic level, if you don't have a program in place yet, and you're just really starting out, NIST CSF is not a bad place to start. It's going to give you the boundaries of things. Now, some people go right to ISO, And ISO is going to give you a similar flavor, but it is going to have you build an authorization boundary. So again, to Dave's point, you can scope it.
Yeah.
You can narrow it, where NIST CSF really is meant to traverse the organization. And frankly, we were involved in NIST CSF, Dave, when we were at CMU. And one of the things we liked about it, we ran the first workshop at Carnegie Mellon with the folks at NIST. And one of the things we liked about it was that it was, in the flavor of RMM, trying to get up at the organizational level to say, you have to frame this. But then, you can pick and choose as you get down into the real practice areas. And you could align the NIST catalog if you wanted, and you could align practices from CMMC or CERT RMM. This is why I keep saying, and I can't say it enough, you will find yourself, and I'm 61 years old, so I'm betting my age on this, you will find yourself in a multi-model environment. It's without a doubt.
So, Rich, I think we've spent more time on this slide than we planned. We have one more question that I love, and this question is: say you have to do NIST for HIPAA. What do you think about using CIS framework and controls to make it easier than the 853 beast? Can you still make the argument you follow NIST, or should you just dig in and bear the beast? You absolutely make the argument that you followed NIST. So here's one of the things. If you go way back to that history diagram that we showed early in the presentation, CIS 20 is one of the key source documents for the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that mapping is there in the informative references. Every subcategory in the NIST CSF is mapped to a CIS 20 control. Now, one word of caution about CIS 20, and I'm a huge fan of CIS 20 because I think that it is a good controls catalog that's much easier to understand and use than 853.
It's consumable for sure.
Yeah, and it's not encumbered by, a lot of 853 content is designed for government classified environments, and most organizations don't have to deal with that, right? So there's a lot of 853 that's going to be left on the cutting room floor for you. So I think CIS 20 is a great choice. So I don't know who asked that question, but thank you for asking that question, because that's one of my favorite patterns.
And also,
you just described.
Also, Dave, look at where it sits.
Yes.
It's kind of bridging a lot of those objectives, I think.
Yeah. So Rich, let's talk a little bit about.
I won't belabor this one too much because we've been talking about it a lot, but selecting a framework and going through the implementation process. Well, before you get the implementation, the selection process is really just the large plan, do, check, act cycle. So, defining why you're doing it and realizing you may have one or more criteria, selecting a framework that nicely, encompasses your why, understanding the overlaps, because those overlaps, look, that slide we just showed you before, all of those frameworks are cousins. They are all reflective of the others. And anybody who builds a framework, including us, who tells you they did it from scratch, probably not telling you the truth. They're relying on the discipline and the body of work that's out there. So they are all connected in some way. And if you look at CMMC, for example, when you go to the back of it, you're going to see that they did best of breed. They took a lot of practices from CERT RMM. They took practices from NIST. They brought in everything into one framework. So by nature, they are also starting to give you some of that connection. And then check the choices that you're selecting against your use cases, your why, because it's really going to tell you if you got 100% coverage, if you're somewhat outside the boundaries, or if you're about to make a bit of a mistake. And then refine it. This is a continuous process. Don't be afraid to spend some time doing this, because it's like you test drive a car, because you don't want to find out in the 3 weeks afterwards that it's not the right car for you. And this is exactly, in a simple way, that.
Yeah. And Rich, this last bullet on the bottom right is it the right size and complexity is so important. And I've seen organizations who are just getting started who then, choose something like High Trust, which is a great framework. Nothing against High Trust, but that's a lot to take
It's
on if
big.
you're just starting to build a program, right?
It
And you
is.
could die under the weight of trying to take that on. And so choosing something that's lighter weight from that upper right quadrant would be a much better place to start, even if ultimately you decide that you want to evolve into that High Trust framework. Starting with something that's easier to swallow, I think would be a great strategy.
Right.
And then finally, I mean, I think if this is sorry, I'll go back for a second. If in RMM we had a lot of those process areas which were like, we'll build a plan and then operationalize the plan. And so this is the operational part of the building of the plan that we covered on the last slide. And the cycle here is a classic plan, do, check, act, where you sort of hinge everything on continuous assessment, gap identification, and making improvements to achieve your objectives. But this part that Rich and I added at the upper left of scoping is so critically important to winning with a framework. Let's spend a few minutes on that, Rich. So tell me why you think that's important, and then.
Yeah. So the really interesting thing, Dave, is that I have a colleague who is texting me that you and I have worked with.
Okay.
who's on this on this webinar, and he knows very well that in the oil and gas industry, for example, it's not monolithic. So you, in an integrated oil and gas company, you might have a production unit, you might have a midstream unit, you might have an energy unit. They are very different businesses. Production is a much more higher risk appetite. Midstream is a lower risk appetite. The energy market's speculative. So, when we were looking at things like adopting, C2N2, we came to the realization that what we were really doing is adopting 3 C2N2s, because doing it at the organizational level and pushing it down would not work. We would have to do it
Right.
at the unit level and push it up. And so that's another, and I think it's actually one of the most important considerations when you're looking at your why, because it's going to impede your implementation. It's going to be a constraint you're going to have to work around.
Well, yeah, because look, you can identifying and prioritizing gaps down here in the operational part of this diagram. You can really only prioritize gaps in the context of your risk, and the context of your risk depends so much on that scope of the assessment, right? So that's one key point that I would make here. The other key point is, your assessment and where you are against one of these frameworks may well change over time, because you may decide in one assessment that a gap is not material. So you're going to give yourself credit for having implemented something, let's say in C2M2 or CSF. And then 2 years later, when the threat landscape has changed or your technology environment has changed, you might then decide that that gap is material. And so your assessment takes a back step and creates an opportunity for improvement. And that's just part of life, I believe, in cybersecurity, where sort of staying in place requires the continuous spending of resources, right? You can't just sit still because the threat landscape isn't. And so don't be afraid if your assessment takes a step back from time to time because your environment has changed or the threat landscape has changed.
So Dave, I think maybe we should take this last question and then go on to the demo, because I'm going to say publicly here, the Axio tool, I'm a fan. I've used the tool. I mean, I know the developers. It was one of the best examples of being able to navigate a multi-model environment, collecting information one time, see it in other forms. And so I'm really excited about, having Dave walk through this, and I'm interested to see how much progress they've made on it. To the question about how does C2M2 map to NIST CSF, well, there is definitely overlap. And in fact,
Yeah.
Dave, I think your model is the perfect example of, feathering out the overlap, right?
Yeah. So I love this question as well. And I did stop screen sharing there for a minute. Sorry about that. You had to see my face again, but I had timed out my login here in the Axio 360 platform. So I needed to get myself logged back in. And didn't want to be distracting while I did that. So look, this is, if you're not familiar with our platform, we do have a free single user lightweight edition of our platform that's available. You can sign up for that on the Axio website. That's at axio.com. That when you first log in and register, you're going to see a welcome screen in the assessment module that looks like this, which says, start an assessment process and then continue that assessment process. We have a number of assessments in the platform today that we support, including C2M2. The C2M2 V2 draft is in there, and we'll be updating that to the most recent draft in a week or two. CIS 20 is coming soon for subscribers, along with CMMC. And then we have the NIST CSF, and we have a couple of proprietary assessments that we've done for special industry associations. And we have an Axio ransomware preparedness assessment. So in the free single user tool, you get C2M2, CSF, and the ransomware assessment. The point that I wanted to make here, look, doing an assessment in Axio 360 is really straightforward. You select your answers to each one of the practices or subcategories. We have places to capture, for you to set a target, capture action items and threaded notes, keep track of evidence. We have rich help text, and there's a new feature in the platform where you can actually ask a question, and that question will be answered by one of the professionals on Axio's services team. So we're really excited about that. I want to go back here to the dashboard for a minute to talk about multi-model view. And so the question was, the most recent question we got was let me read it here. How does C2M2 map to NIST CSF? When to use each? Can they be used together? So we actually have a lot of Axio 360 users that are using C2M2 to drive improvement and CSF for reporting. The Department of Energy published a mapping from C2M2 to CSF. And so in the Axio platform, for a C2M2 assessment, this is the dashboard for a C2M2 assessment, and you can see the assessment activities over time with these sort of chalk lines showing different milestones that I've created. If I'm making improvements, my dark blues should be consuming my lighter colors of blues here. But look here, here's a NIST CSF comparison. So there is your derived score from a C2M2 in CSF. And so we have a lot of organizations that are using C2M2 for improvement. I'm having a Zoom issue there. And they're using CSF for reporting to executives and the board. So that's a great use case for the platform. And that's an example of the power of using a platform like Axio 360 for
Dave,
a multi-model environment.
And Dave, I think it's also an example of customer driving this, right? Because, C2M2 users are recognizing that for their security improvement program and aligning with, the sector's goals, they have to use C2M2, but their board wants to hear about NIST CSF.
Yeah.
And so you have to make that translation. And that's why I say I would bet money on the fact that you'll be in a multi-model environment no matter what you're doing. And I'm working with, organizations that I know that are, juggling 2 or 3 of them at one time.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'll just before we leave the demo portion, we also have benchmark views on the platform for both CSF and C2M2. Those will be coming soon for the other models as we build up our data set. And recently we added the pop-out view, or this sort of expando view, where you can see benchmark data at the domain level in C2M2, and that's available at the function level in CSF.
And Dave, if I can make another point, these process areas, if you see them in high trust and you see them in ISO and you see them in C2M2 and RMM and CMMC, look, vulnerability management is vulnerability management.
Yes.
So if you're looking at vol management in ISO, but you've already done C2M2 or NIST CSF, you're going to have a pretty darn good idea of how much saturation you already got in the ISO side. And you're going to know, you could then look with critical eyes to ISO if you think you want to take it on. You're going to know how much you've already accomplished. And that is just another reason to, be a wise consumer, that, pick a framework that you think is going to give you opportunity across what you think your industry might recommend, and so on, because some of these things, vol management, incident management, change control, they're going to be in all these frameworks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's another great point, Rich. I think for now, let's move back to the. I'm just going to leave this summary up here. So again, there is a free lightweight single user version of the Axio 360 platform. You can sign up for that on the Axio website at axio.com. That does provide CSF, C2M2, and the Axio's ransomware preparedness assessments. I talked about how you can derive CSF results from C2M2 assessments. That was part of the demo. You can also, in the platform, actually produce a CSF report, a detailed report from a C2M2 assessment. And then there are a lot of additional features that are available to our subscribers, including coming soon, the CMMC, CIS 20, and custom assessments. We have a lot of clients that are now configuring custom assessments in the Axio 360 platform, because they've reached that point where they really want to kind of own their own control framework and improvement assessment, and so they're starting to build that. We support that now as well. So let me pause there and open the floor for questions. See if we have any more questions coming in. And Rich, feel free to comment further if you.
Yeah, I think the last point you made about using your own sort of framework is just another great way to, if you can get a few areas like incident management or vulnerability management or change control or config management, I could go on and on. If you can get those down to a place where you've got good control on them and you can measure them in this tool, then as you go into these other frameworks, you'll see the saturation. You'll see how much you've achieved. So that is actually another great way to start. To the question that came earlier about where do I start? Sometimes the best place to start is to pick a domain or a process area that might likely be in one or more frameworks and work on it.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to collect once and comply many times.
Yeah. We did have another question come in, Rich. As an industry, excuse me, as an industry, how do we get to less of these things? And I assume, yeah. So do you have an opinion about that?
Well, I mean, tools are the way I think you're going to bring the noise together, because as I just said, they are all cousins. They are all flavors of the same thing. Yeah, in high trust, you're going to see it a little bit more skewed toward a very specific type of information. And I was saying to Dave yesterday, if you work in an information-centric organization like a bank, then confidentiality leads and integrity and availability follow. But like in an oil and gas industry, availability leads, and then C&I. So you have an ACI versus a CIA. And the way that you really can kind of overcome, too many frameworks and too many industries develop, is get good at the basics. Get good at those 5 or 6 that, they're fundamental to all of them. And I bet we could do a back of the envelope really quickly, Dave, that said, incident management shows up in 18 of 24. It's in high trust, it's in ISO, it's in CMMC. That's one of the ways you get over this. I don't think we'll ever see industry stop building industry-specific frameworks, frankly.
No, in fact, I think we're going to see more of them. One of the things, I mean, if you think about some of the things that have happened over recent months with SolarWinds and the massive exchange vulnerability, the industrialization and commercialization of ransomware attacks. I think we're going to see more, and and I'm, I don't want to be a downer and say I think we're going to see more regulation, but I think with events like that have the sort of cross industry global impact, we might well see an increasing regulatory environment around cybersecurity. And so I think that's just another reason why organizations, it's in all of our interest for all of us to be prudent and demonstrate that we understand our risk and that we're managing our risk. We do have another question. How can I use assessments to help me understand my cybersecurity risk?
Excellent question.
It's a great question. Thank you, John Fry. John Fry actually signed that, so thank you, John.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And why do I love Axio? Because it takes a risk perspective first. I love that you use the risk assessment to drive your framework, either your framework selection or your framework saturation.
Yeah. And I think you have to be a little bit careful. You know, I see folks making I think there's just because you're not doing something in one of these frameworks doesn't necessarily mean that you're accepting a risk. Right. In the same way that just because you are doing it doesn't necessarily mean that you've mitigated that risk, right? And so I think a lot of these models and frameworks are their activities, they're things to do and controls to implement that I think there's a great deal of agreement makes a difference in our cybersecurity posture and reduces our exposure to risk. But your organization is different from my organization, is different from somebody else's organization. And so really to use assessments to better understand the risk really requires that you think about what risk are you accepting as a result of not doing something in those frameworks, and have you really mitigated the risk that you're facing by implementing something in the way that you've implemented it from one of those frameworks. And I
can put a finer point on it, Dave.
Right.
So risk assessment by nature is fed by two sources: knowing your environment, so doing a threat assessment, vulnerability assessment, adding those to your risk register. But your framework assessment is also going to populate your risk register. So as Dave said, if you're missing a certain practice, it might imply that you have a hole, right, and a vulnerability. So it's going to populate the risk register. What's interesting then is that you can go back to the framework then and apply the treatment plans from the framework. So, it's risk assessment is a domain in these frameworks, but it is also an enterprise-wide activity that the frameworks are informing and also helping you fix the risks. So remember, when you get down into those control catalogs, you're applying those controls as treatments against risk that you've identified in your register. So it's all intertwined.
Yep. Yeah. That's a great point. We do have one more question. Multi-framework worlds aside, how do you convince management to pay for a tool like Axio when there are free tools from NIST and others? So, Axio has a free tool as well, right? And so, and it's the intention of our free tool that if you're running a really small program with maybe one person or a part-time person running your cybersecurity program, then we believe that our free tool for assessment is going to be as much as you need, right? For teams, you probably want to move into one of our subscriber tiers. We have multiple subscriber tiers, and we're happy to work with you on use cases and justification if you want to explore that with us. And we're happy to help you make that argument, because the argument that you might make to your management is different than the argument that somebody else might make to their management. And we might find that if your program is small enough that our free tool might just be enough. That's why we have it out there.
And you're selling yourself short there, Dave, because the the beauty that comes out of a tool like Axio is your best selling point to management, because it puts all of this craziness in consumable business language. You're not going to walk into your board and say 853 and they're going to be like, what? But if you take a nice beautiful picture in there, and the stuff that comes out of a tool like this, that's how we hooked management on using Axio. That's one of the ways you'll do it.
Great. Okay. Looks like we just hit the top of the hour. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Let's call it a wrap. This will be available on Bright Talk. It'll be available on the Axio website. We do have the presentation materials available as well if you're interested in downloading those. For more information about Axio, please email info@axio.com or visit our website, axio.com. For information about CISO, please visit their website, www.seisollc.com. And we really appreciate you joining us today. And Rich, thank you very much for your help. Great work.
Thank you, Dave. Pleasure being with you again.
Bye now.